So science has this long tradition of sort of the crazy mystic scientists that they put up with. Francis Crick was one of them. There have been many throughout history. And even Descartes, who came up with the Cartesian system, described that it was an angel that gave him. And Isaac Newton was very mystical, in a sense an alchemist.
Bruce Damer is a leading figure in astrobiology. He offers a unique perspective on our origins and future. He's got a background in spacecraft designed for NASA and a focus on mindfulness and psychedelics.
But I was suddenly more alive. And I could watch the molecules moving, all the piano keys, and watch the chemistry working. And that vision led to this new hypothesis for origin of life, because what I was witnessing as an embodiment, and this is an old way of doing science, that scientists actually embody their problem. It has been done. It was done by Albert Einstein, for example. This is how he came up with special and general relativity, by becoming it.
Would you say like you have like shaman gifts or special gifts?
It's sort of shamanic. It's shamanic science.
Hello and welcome to this podcast, the Harvest Series podcast. We are in Kaplanskaya and we are going to talk about the origins of life. Only that. My guest today is Bruce Damer. He's a leading figure in astrobiology. He offers a unique perspective on our origins and future. He's got a background in spacecraft designed for NASA and a focus on mindfulness and psychedelics. Hello, Bruce.
Hello.
Thank you for making it here to this villa for the podcast first. Because you
we did a roundabout maze threading, but I saw all of Kaplanskaya, which is beautiful.
That's a positive way to put it. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thanks for being here. And we're going to talk about something very, very deep today, the origins of life. So my children, they're 9 and 12 years old, and they keep asking me about this. It's very difficult to answer for me. So maybe you could explain and give and explain, because you made recent discoveries. So maybe you can help me saying what we thought before and what you discovered, and say it for children of 9 and 12 years old.
9 and 12 years old. Well, what we thought throughout our history, all the way back, to the humans have been wondering, where this all came from. And there's many mythos or mythologies around the origin of life, creation stories, if you will.
Yeah.
But the scientific creation quest really started with Charles Darwin. Late in his life, he wrote a letter to his friend Joseph Hooker, in which he said, I think that maybe a big if, somewhere there's a warm little pond, far back, that has all sorts of phosphoric salts, light, electricity, etc., that a protein could form and get more complex. And this is 1871, 150 years ago. And he actually got it right. Or more right than we know. So for the next 150 years, science started looking first in kind of soups, stuff floating on the surface of the ocean. That was an idea. Then the famous spark chamber experiments that are the subject of all horror movies, scientific horror movies, where there's sparks going through a glass chamber, and it's forming these dark compounds, which were amino acids. That's Miller and Urey in the 1950s. And that started this real scientific quest. Because if you could form amino acids in the early atmosphere through lightning, that was a source of the building blocks of life. And then in the 70s, they discovered hydrothermal vents in the ocean, these deep towers of water coming out. And so the field looked at that for a while, but it never worked out, because if you're in water, things just dissolve. So if you formed some of those basic building blocks of life, they would just dissipate into the ocean. And then in 2010 to 2012, the field started to shift back to Darwin's warm little pond. They started to really looking at that. And my colleague Dave Deemer at the University of California, Santa Cruz had discovered that if you wet and dry solutions, go through wet phase and then a dry phase and a wet phase and a dry phase, you can form things called biopolymers. You can take the building blocks of RNA, which is an important polymer for life, and stitch them together when they're drying down. And it's a way to do it without having to have what's called an enzyme to do it for you. And it was an amazing discovery. And earlier, he also discovered that from meteorites, from space, from asteroids, if you ground them up, certain types of asteroids, and put them into water, membranes would come out. So here we have the two things you need to really create what we call protocells. Polymers of RNA, which are considered important to get life started, and membranes, which is, we are bags of membranes. It's like our cell walls are membranes that can surround them and form these little units called a protocell. And so what we did is we put it all together in 2012, 13, 14 and said, what if it was in a hot spring? The hot spring is filled up all the time, dries down, filled up, dries down every 20 minutes or every 2 hours, or because hot springs they're like a clock going off. And what happens at the edge of the pool? So we started to go out to hot springs and look at them. These are hot springs with active volcanoes nearby. So they're pretty fun places to visit, a little dangerous though.
Okay.
And we started to notice that around the edges of the pools were these rings of organic material. And it all came together in 2014. And we proposed that it's cycling hot spring pools that can bring together all these components that may be coming from the sky, from the solar system 4 billion years ago, and forming these protocells that are budding off into the pool. Then the pool dries down, then they come back and they form this clump that then, this is where metabolism starts, and then they get into sheets, into layers like a bathtub ring. That's when you synthesize them again, the polymers again, and it's a life cycle. And since then, we've gone to hot springs in New Zealand, Yellowstone. There's a new expedition there to Iceland in next month. And it works. So it works not only in the lab in little dishes, it also works out in real environments that you would have found on Mars 4 billion years ago. They would have been, certainly they were on the Earth 4 billion years ago. So it seems like it's hot little pools with all the ingredients coming in that create a soup, an ingredients, and if you cycle and stir that soup, eventually you can get living cells.
Wow, so that's still a bit technical to explain to my son.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
At philosophy classes, I learned that life, to describe life as something alive is something that can die. Is it not the good definition?
There's so many definitions of life. So that what we did was also about 5 years ago came up with a proposal for an origin of life, and because it's simpler. Life does so many things, has so many moving parts, and what we came up with was a system that can have a memory of its state, that it can make more of itself into a new generation, and then it runs interconnections. It runs network interconnections. And we call that PIM, for probability, interaction, and memory. And it seems to work chemically. Like we see it under microscopes working in that way. And it's like the core algorithm of emergence itself that leads to life, but is also even driving technology and culture. So that's the discovery I've been talking about today at Harvest.
Wow.
On the stage was we may have discovered this core kernel of an operating system that is running all of reality. And we did it by going back to unwind life to its simplest starting place. Kind of like if you want to understand particle physics, you break the atoms up into the little bits. But what we're doing in the 21st century is breaking biology down to its starting point and seeing how it gets started, and then it's a great teacher for us. So it teaches us that death writes the code of life. So your mention about death, you have to have things that are selected out and that fall apart in order to have things that are better at not falling apart and cycling systems. So death is essential to write the code of life.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So what does it mean, your discovery for humanity?
I think it's a big philosophical impact, because if we roll the clock back to the 1920s, the biggest scientific discovery of the 1920s was relativity theory. Albert Einstein. He became a scientific rock star, the first scientist people could recognize in public with his crazy hair, and he was on tour with Charlie Chaplin and this whole thing in the 1920s. And relativity theory was validated in the eclipse of 1919. So it actually had a proof. And then it went on to be one of the bases of modernism that was coming in, which said even time is variable and flexible, time and space. There are no absolutes, there are no absolute positions. And so that's when the empires had fallen and kingship and things like this, and societal norms were shifting. Women were being empowered. There was technology of radio coming. It was a huge decade, the 1920s. So in the 2020s, what we're hoping is something very positive impact from this, from the origin of life, because what we're proposing is that life did not start as competing individuals that were fighting it out. Because why? Those little protocells that are so simple, they don't have any tools to compete. They only have the ability to cooperate. So if what we notice when we make protocells in the laboratories, we get more of them because the RNA is helping stabilize the container, so there's more containers, less broken cups in a way. And so you get all these cups on a shelf that have now appeared, and stuff goes between them.
What kind of stuff?
So if you have some chemistry in one, it might serve to support another cup.
Okay.
And so the origin of life was communal. It wasn't individuals at all, it was a community. So our deepest ancestor is a community in relationship, sharing resources to grow and survive in this very tough environment 4 billion years ago. So our common ancestor is not an ancestor the way we thought, it's a community. So the common ancestor of all life is a community. And then when you scale that up and you realize everything is communal, the microbial world still runs everything, and we're here by the grace of them. You know, they digest our food in our microbiome. We carry them around, and they eventually digest us. But that we could really look through the lens of the communal origin of life and say, wow, there's no separation. There are no individuals, actually, in biology. Everything is deeply connected. And there's a second implication, which is that as life gets going, it generates all these beautiful byproducts, connections, hormones, wiggles, sort of electromagnetic wiggles, if you will. And science is just starting to detect that life is generating this interconnected field that we're in. So when we think of the power of positive thinking or amazing, seemingly miraculous things that happen due to our intention, there may be a real basis for that. That we may be in a probabilistic field that shapes reality, that shapes our futures, and that we're conscious of it, and our consciousness is made possible by that, and that every organism around us is connected to us. And, you know, of course, we're driving evolution now. Humans so dominate the planet, but we've internetworked the entire planet. So we end up in this situation where things that seem very strange or coincidental, or even, say, in the psychedelic realm, you enter these amazing spaces, and non-psychedelics, even in Vipassana or altered states of some sort, people enter this thing that you could call unity consciousness, which is an extraordinary vision, extraordinary embodied experience, that is the field that life makes, and that we're waking up to that in the way that we primates can do, because other organisms would wake up to it in different ways. We can connect in with that, and it may be the greatest tool for our healing and then our revealing that we'll ever have. So more and more people, not just the sages of old, enter into these samadhi states. And so more and more people are going in and out of them through various practices. And it changes humanity. And it changes a person in a minute, that type of experience, when you meet someone who's had that kind of experience.
Yeah. So are you suggesting that because we were born, life was born in thanks to communion and positivity, maybe that we derailed a little bit with our structures and organization that led to a lot of conflict, and that's the ultimate goal is that we found our communion and positivity again? Or am I going to be too far?
I think that's a pretty good summary. And in fact, there's a great teacher I love to follow. His name was Richard Alpert, and he was known as Ram Dass for most of his practice. And he talks about at age 35, when he was still at Harvard, he was a young professor at Harvard working with Timothy Leary, that he was trapped in the myth of separation and isolation, that it was just Richard Alpert, the academic, the pilot, all these sorts of things, but kind of fearful, kind of isolated, but putting on a good appearance. And then he took psilocybin. So he took psilocybin. This was long before it was illegal. They were experimenting with it. And he took it in Tim Leary's kitchen, and Allen Ginsberg was there. And Tim and Allen were just chatting. And Richard couldn't stand the conversation, so he went into the living room and he sat down on the couch because the whole psychedelic experience was coming on. It was his first time. And he thought, at least I've got my body. And then suddenly he was outside of himself looking down, and there was no body. There was no Richard Alpert. And he joined into this field. And he was separated from all of that he thought was himself, vanished into the distance, and he was in another plane of consciousness. And he'd never experienced that before. Even though he was a PhD in psychology, he'd never experienced planes of consciousness. And from that moment, he was a changed human. And he let go of all of that stuff. And he thought, I've been trapped in this myth of my own isolation until I was 35 years old, and I'm popped out of it. So perhaps that's a great hope for humanity, that more of us can experience that, because it's in the Buddhist way, it's a true relief from suffering, because suffering is another word for fear and isolation or aloneness, which we have a lot of in the world, anxiety, things like that.
And what's your relationship with your experience with psychedelics, and did it help you to make these discoveries?
It very much did, in that I had to decode myself as an adult, because I was adopted at birth. So I was given by my mother in a minute or two to a nurse and taken into a ward, where I was there for 10, 11 days and then taken home by a beautiful adoptive family. But as a baby, I never got the mother's touch or her face or her smell or voice, didn't have that.
Okay.
And adopted people have higher rates of psychiatric conditions because of this. It's a big rupture, but the baby doesn't know what it doesn't know, what is missing. So I had to put it all back together. When my adoptive mother picked me up for the first time, she looked into my eyes and said, "This one is in its own world." So I had made a bubble that I was in. And I would have been called autistic in the 1960s, but there was no word for that. So I was just sort of left alone. I could wander the countryside, but I could travel above the landscape. I could literally fly in my mind. Because I was what you could call dissociated, but it gave me a superpower. But later on, it was a problem because I couldn't make eye contact with people.
Okay.
I was, very nerdy, if you will. And I stopped being able to feel emotions by my 20s. There was just none left.
Okay.
It was all concrete.
Okay.
So then I had to work out of that. And when I started feeling again, I could feel a knot in my belly. There was a painful knot. And I used, over the years, psychedelics, specifically ayahuasca, to ask that knot what it was. With the help of this great medicine and sort of the teacher that it is, it turned out to be me as an embryo that was all crunched up. And so one night in the Peruvian Amazon, it unfolded. The whole embryo unfolded, and it was just stunning. It was the shaman came over because I was doing this work, and the shaman can't see or know what you're doing. They just do the things to help. And the next night, I birthed it. I birthed it as a baby. It was me. And I cut the cord with my teeth. This is all seemingly metaphoric, but it's extremely real and visceral when you're in these experiences.
So you recreated the birth
the
proper birth you didn't have as you wished you had, or not?
Exactly.
Okay.
So I rebirthed me, and then I could care for that part that had not been cared for. I could do it myself. And that's the secret to all healing modalities. No matter what you hear, it's about becoming your own parent, your own giver of care to the parts of you. And then they can get the resource.
So you changed completely from that day, or?
It took a while because I would fall back into dissociation or maybe anxiety, but it unwound so much that I was able to undergo a big shift. And at the same time, I noticed my mental clarity, the science was getting better and better. So I realized after the healing comes the revealing, and this may be a true thing in general, that when people do these healing things, maybe in villages in Europe 25,000 years ago, there was a shaman that would arrive, work through the issues of the families, or somebody's sick, and then they would have a ceremony. Like the Iceman that was found in Austria or in Italy, possibly was carrying medicines, and that they were undergoing healing, then revealing. They were dancing, they were coming together, their culture, they were seeing their ancestors or their futures. And so I realized this is an old pattern. So I then started to apply my science to altered states. I started experimenting with, can I, having worked on the birth of me, work on the question of the birth of all life. And it was easy. It was a short step between the embryo unfolding and me suddenly becoming the protocell one night in Peru and becoming the first attempted birth. And I literally woke up in the vision of the Aya as a body, as the protocell. I was those chemicals, that membrane, etc., watching a tearing off of a black compartment. And I was screaming.
Okay.
There was a scream, and the black compartment was dead. But I was suddenly more alive. And I could watch the molecules moving, all the piano keys, and watch the chemistry working. And that vision led to this new hypothesis for origin of life. Because what I was witnessing as an embodiment, and this is an old way of doing science, that scientists actually embody their problem. It has been done. It was done by Albert Einstein, for example. This is how he came up with special and general relativity, by becoming it.
Wow. And would you say you have shaman gifts or special gifts?
It's sort of shamanic.
Yeah.
It's shamanic science. And yet what you have to do, so I saw that, and it was not the whole picture. So I drew it. I went back to my little hut and I drew notebooks full of things and wrote everything, and I reran it over and over and over again. And then 3 months later, just in a breathwork session, the whole download then came. The answer came. And I saw the entire hot spring, trillions of protocells, evolution starting, all the steps. And so I filled notebooks full of those drawings, sent it to Dave, my colleague, and he wrote back, "You found it. You found the kinetic trap. You found the answer." So then we turned that into a scientific publication in 2015 that launched this whole approach. And then experiments in the hot springs and many, many labs replicating what we were doing with wet and dry cycling. And then 2020 was the big publication. It was on the cover of Astrobiology magazine, a big scientific journal, sort of announcing this entire scenario. And I involved 40 colleagues in the review of the article and making sure it was referenced all their work too. And it's a compendium of all of this thinking for 100 years. Yeah.
What a story! Like it's almost it's very difficult to imagine, and especially for the scientific world, because it sounds very different from these very Cartesian scientists. So how did they welcome this? Because it could look also like a big delirium for them.
Mm-hmm. So science has this long tradition of sort of the crazy mystic scientists that they put up with. Francis Crick was one of them. There have been many throughout history. And even Descartes, who came up with the Cartesian system, described that it was an angel that gave him. So, and Isaac Newton was very mystical. Yeah, he was in a sense an alchemist. So throughout history, there have been these people that did through dreams and et cetera, et cetera. And I realized I'm probably one of them, but I have to be careful. So in 2016, I was contacted by a major magazine for an interview based on this, and I said no, because it would...
You said no, you mean you didn't explain...
I wouldn't do the interview.
Oh, okay, I didn't do the interview, yeah.
It was actually the New Yorker. So it would have been a fairly big piece, but it was 2016, and our publications, I felt it would risk the science.
Oh, okay.
So I didn't want to risk my position.
You were scared of this, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, a position on NASA review boards that I had, conference organizations, funding, applying for funding. And I thought, no, the science comes first, not my own personal interest in me. And so it wasn't until 2022 when Dennis McKenna, who I'd known for many years, the brother of Terence McKenna, he said, "Why don't you come and do a keynote at our conference in England in 2022? And I said, you know what? It's time. I've just turned 60. And I sent him a proposal for the talk, which is called It's High Time for Science. And I gave an hour and a half long.
High like a...
Kind of, yeah.
Ambiguity.
Ambiguity. So, and the talk went a little bit viral, and there wasn't any kind of negative consequence in the community. People were curious. I wanted to serve as an example for young scientists and engineers, designers, and even leaders that we can use these tools if done carefully. And it brought in investors. It brought in Ford and Sylvia in Austin, Texas, who I met at a party with Catherine and I were at a big birthday party there about 2 months later, and they said, we want to support this as a new research organization. So we have MAPS, which you've heard about, yes. The Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. I've known Rick Doblin, who founded MAPS for many years, and all those people. And I said, well, then we need to create a new organization. We're going to call it MINDS, because it's multidisciplinary investigation into novel discoveries and solutions, land them in the world. And we're going to fund the research. We're going to fund the research into psychedelics and creativity that was abandoned in 1966 and stopped, just as therapeutics, like for alcoholism or trauma, stopped in the mid-60s and only restarted in the last 25 years. Also the work in creativity. which Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond, some of the founders of psychedelics in the West, thought was the real use of them, was for the intellect, was for creative insight. They call it outsight.
Okay.
And it just didn't get going, and yet all of this was happening sort of under the table. So we founded Minds, and it came into being in the fall of last year, 2023, and so many people have shown up. We have a fantastic team they're running it. Rick Doblin of MAPS joined our board. We have many sort of famous names who put their names to it, and we have donors now showing up. And it's different than the psychedelic, than the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy world, you know, of therapists and healers. This is entrepreneurs. This is sort of change makers, impact people in society, some of whom have had their own visionary experiences and want to give back.
Okay.
They want to have it as a tool for changing capitalism itself, changing the prime motivation of capitalism, which might be based a little bit on performance and fear and things like that, top to bottom, from the boardroom, from C-suite all the way to the engineering lab, to marketing, to making more beautiful companies, you know, a more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible, as Charles Eisenstein says. But that we can provide the science that backs how to do this safely and effectively, because it's for healthy individuals. This is not therapeutic. We can potentially change society top to bottom, because capitalism and business is the lever that moves the world.
Yeah.
And these are business people who are coming to the Minds community and saying, yes, this tool has changed my life, my company's prospects, how I decide what to do, how I deal with where I want to put my wealth, and I want to be of service. And they were partly brought there by psychedelic, and certainly by Vipassana and endogenous methods too, lifestyle changes. And so we're hoping to provide a home for them, and then basically do the research that was stopped 50 years ago, get it started again, get protocols, so we can publish protocols that groups can then set up retreats for business executives or for the great scientists, and a whole community will emerge and bloom around this practice. And we have to do it safely and securely, because people like me who are on the spectrum, the autism spectrum, I wisely stayed away from any drugs until I was 36 years old. I think my system was very fragile, and I didn't have any guidance. The reason I did my first mushroom or psilocybin experience was I met Terence McKenna, who was really well known in that space. And I showed him cyberspace, and then he showed me hyperspace. And he wasn't, he was a beautiful man, high intellect, and he wasn't destroyed by that experience. And we sort of swapped places. And he was a beautiful mentor into that world. And, but I'm glad that I was fully formed by that. I had a good sort of I had an observer, you know, in the Buddhist tradition or the meditative tradition. I had a good, strong observer online. So when I took that dose, that very high dose of psilocybin mushrooms, I didn't fall into the abyss. I watched from outside all the things that were happening, and what was happening were the parts of me doing their thing. And so then years later with ayahuasca, I was able to finally talk to those parts and help resource and heal those parts. But I had no guidance. There was no framework. I had to work it all out. But I think that now we have so many tools. We have so many people who are so wise in this space. You've interviewed many of them.
Yeah.
And we can really do this. And that these are, I would agree with Terence, are the most potent change-making tool that we have for the human mind and heart that we've ever touched, and they've come to us in this time, and we should really use them responsibly.
Right. But I think, do you think, like, for the majority of people, they would be a bit shocked if we had to tell them like the solution would be to give psychedelics to the leaders, no?
It depends. It would come down to the state of the individual. It wouldn't matter if it was a president of our country or a student in college. It's just a person to person. I think, leaders can be a specific personality type that might be running a little bit more of a psychopathic program. So you would have to basically interview them and actually do a workup on their personality and the things that they could work on. Now, the reason that they may have become a leader is through the use of non-empathetic kind of, because they can exert power, they might have charisma, but that's also perhaps representing something that's a deep wound. Yeah. It's coming from there. So they would have to accept the proposal that this is causing them suffering and others suffering, and that they want to be free of that, which means that everything they've worked toward to become a leader is different than they thought. So they would be transformed, but they have to come to that on their own. It's not that we're requiring all our leaders to do that. Although in the business world, what I'm seeing is the business people who've done their work, especially investors, are now very wise to the companies and the founders that they're investing in, checking them out. Have you done your work? Do you have a spiritual practice? Have you worked through some of your issues? Have you done psychedelics in a setting that was healthy, not just drugs? I think long ago investors would be reticent about somebody with a cocaine habit. So also, why not look at investing in companies where the founders are really clear and they've done a lot of their personal work? Just through experience, we know it's going to be a better run. It's going to be a better likelihood of success in those companies. So it just makes better business sense to ask that question and to do your analysis if you're putting dollars in.
There is this question because I've been interviewing a lot about the psychedelics, and my question is like people talking about psychedelics always suggest that it's going to make you a better person. Can it make you a worse person?
Definitely can. So Sasha Shulgin and his wife Anne Shulgin, they came up with this map, and there's one thing on the map that Anne suggested, which is psychedelics can cause expansion. Where you expand, and it's an huge ego expansion. Oh, okay. Oh, not good. It's not necessarily good. And so there are many ways to sort of go off the psychedelic rails. So it all comes down to set and setting. We've heard about that before. The set's the way you come in. The setting is the environment you're doing it. But we would propose setup. And that's all the screening. It's all the preparations. It's the workup of you maybe using an internal family systems with a practitioner to find out what the parts of you are doing. And across the sea here, at Eleusis in Greece, for 1,600 years, there was a ceremony every September for 1,000 people who went through what's called the Lesser Mysteries for, I think they arrived in Athens in January, and they went through a setup, preparation, stripped down to basic clothes. So if you were, some kind of local important person, you became the same as the cohort you were with. They switched their diets. They went into the sea. There were all these things that by the time September came around, they would walk all the way up to the Eleusinian plains across this narrow bridge. And the villagers of Eleusis would scream insults at them. Okay. To bring them down. Okay. And then when they would be humbled by this, and then they would get into the temple, the Telesterion complex, which is still there. You can visit that. Huge complex. The temple is underground. It's like partly buried in the ground. It seats 1,000 people. And what's believed by many scholars now, they were giving them an ergot-based LSD-like potion that had the power to kill you as well, because it was an ergot which is a very, very potent neurotoxin.
Okay.
But the women of Eleusis had figured this out, and they had brewed what's called the kukion. And everyone from Augustus Caesar to the great philosophers, and it was open to women, it was open to anyone in their lifetime, and actually the only requirement at one point was that they had to speak Greek. So generations went through this, and the idea was you turned people from the hunter-gatherers of the Upper Paleolithic, they came out the other end building civilization, creating the three-cameral house Greek democratic system came out of Eleusis. Aqueduct construction, the theater, the academy itself, philosophy, and Eleusis went all the way into the late Roman period to about the 5th century. And then it was destroyed actually by Christians who saw it as a competing system. So they actually knocked the temple down using basically Germanic tribes that they paid to knock. Yeah, and it was taken out of circulation. So we lost initiation. So for 1600 years, we had an initiation into a state that Plato called the greater mysteries, sort of the greatest light that had ever come in. You know, he wrote about it in his philosophy. So that's possibly the source of antiquity of the entire classical world through these mystery schools, which we then lost, and it was replaced by hierarchical religious structures, which then became corporate structures. So, you know, the apostolic Catholic Church, and in the subsequent centuries, and then all these large hierarchical corporate structures. And then in the 1960s, the potency of an ergot-based psychedelic called LSD blew into the culture back. It returned in the Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco and then all over the planet, and we saw the results were just extraordinary. And we're still in that. But we live in a Roman world. We live in a Roman Greek reality still. Everybody does. And yet the potion that made it possible, the genius of that has just returned. So it's really fresh. So how do we use that in the 21st century as we have climate change coming and all this? We finally got some of the most powerful tools that the ancients had, and that created an astonishing world, which had some of its problems, but it was a far cry from the Upper Paleolithic. It was this stunning invention. Yeah.
Wow. So we began this interview with the origins of life, with what you told me. What is your intuition for the long-term future for this planet and for humanity?
I think that the prognosis is pretty good, because what we're looking at, so at the same time as you have panic and doubt, and let's face it, I mean, all of the anxiety, all of the conflict is created by people who are suffering. So the different wars, it's usually men who are convincing younger men to go off and do something that's either a suffering or an ego thing. And it's a very small percentage of the population that create land wars, for example. You can identify them. You can list them. So we ask ourselves, having woken up, it's not just that war is inevitable. We know the personality type and the conditions which lead to conflict. We just know it. Yeah. And we also know how to intervene. We have actually the skills to actually intervene. So say, for instance, in your own family, there's someone who's just always negative, always taking the energy out of the room. Well, in the past, it would be just we'd accept it. Oh, that's just the way they are. Nothing can be done. Now we know there's a way to help them.
But these people usually don't want to heal. Are the ones who don't want to heal, no?
But if society decides to not accept them as leaders because of the risk involved, because there are very smart people that can predict the likelihood of, say, a given leader deciding to do a certain thing. You can predict it ahead of time. So then society has to sort of, in a sense, take adult control and head off these problems. Like if you have a little kid in the kindergarten that you know is going to bring a stick inside and hit another kid, if you're a wise kindergarten teacher, you're watching those kids. And if that boy is like hidden a stick in the locker and is going to bring it in because you know there's a dispute, you just kindly intervene. So if we can just say to ourselves, so the world always, one of the things I heard at Harvest, which is actually frankly quite annoying to me because I've been going to these meetings for 35 years, there are people who stand up and say, it's the worst of times. It's not, In 1982, people were saying the same thing.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's just...
It's just the most recent time.
Yeah, it's annoying because it's almost like a stylistic thing that you say that people then nod, but it's not productive.
Okay.
There's no solution there. And it's actually become annoying to me over time because in some sense, we're all so much wiser. We created the problems for ourselves. It's mostly in our heads and in our hearts. It's mostly the things that we just have decided by default to accept. We don't have to accept them anymore. We've woken up a lot more to personality types and managing the kid that's going to get the stick and cause all this trouble. So we learn to manage that so we don't have these military conflicts, which are very destructive. Then we have to go on to the real problems, which is, an ecosystem or a world biosphere that's now got so much more energy in it that we're going to have, this entire coast of Turkey looks just like, when I was driving in, it looks like California before the huge wildfires. So everything that you see here could burn at 1,000 degrees Celsius in 3 weeks. Yeah. This whole coast is very, very vulnerable because some of the trees are full of oil, like the olive trees. So when they burn. So all you need is to have less marine influence, less fog, and a heat event that dries everything out and then winds, and one spark, and the entire coast will burn. And that's just a reality. So if we can stop focusing on sort of the fake news and all the people taking advantage of that, playing the game or gaming, and manage the humans that will cause a lot of problems, then we can focus on really dealing with what we have to deal with. But we have to fix ecosystems. We have to having healthier environments for children. We have to get smartphones out of children's hands, because now it's been shown that it's created an epidemic of anxiety and suicidal depression. So we made a mistake. Steve Jobs, who invented the iPhone, basically would not allow his kids to use them. Yeah. And so we've made a mistake.
And everybody's struggling and admits they're struggling.
Yeah, so we have to back out of mistakes we've made. And that one of the great speakers, Pablo, talked about it in his talk here at Harvest, which is things we got wrong in a generation or two ago, that we have to pull back and say, no, we have to make them right. So, and they're big things, like where do we get our energy from? We have to seriously look at that. Cell phones in children's hands is one of the big mistakes that we're making, that's actively happening now. But a whole generation is being damaged, but we have to take measures. And so all of these, so unlike previous generations where we felt sort of helpless, or that's just how things happen, we know how they go down. We know how to intervene. We know how to intervene, and we can do it. And there are enough people in positions of power, especially in the business community, financial power, who can pull the lever. Because politics is always going to be politics, but people with tremendous resources are waking up. They're also getting healed. They're getting softer. They're getting more visionary. They're getting smarter. And I think that they can pull the levers. And it doesn't even have to be very public. From behind the scenes, to shift our politics a bit, but then also to shift their own businesses, because the world does turn on business.
This is in the US. We could imagine this in the long term in the US, but in the other parts of the world, it seems like very far away.
I've met Chinese billionaires. I've met South Asian billionaires. I've met even Russians who have unfortunately had to flee that have the same vision. And certainly here in Europe.
Okay.
Absolutely. There are so many. It's really global. It's just completely global. And I think they're the most important new class of people who've sort of woken up. And that's why we established minds, to provide the tools for them that they would trust as well. We have to do all the science. So I'm pretty optimistic. I think we could make it easier on ourselves by not believing in, or, you know, back when I was a kid, there was, if you checked out of the shops, like in the grocery store, there would be these crazy newspapers right before you checked out, National Enquirer, and these crazy newspapers that had all this made up stuff.
Yeah.
Like there'd be a picture of an alien.
Yeah.
As kids, we sometimes bought them and we would just laugh at it. We've allowed that kind of stuff to go into the main news feed, right? All the ways that news is presented to, crazy claims and things like this that isn't really news. It's designed to get our attention. We have to back out from that. Mm-hmm. As a society, we have to basically say no. We want sanity, and we don't want people giving us misinformation anymore. But we have to, as a society, decide, turn it off. And so there are ways to, if we turn that off, we get mental clarity, we take the phones away from our kids, we start focusing on raising healthy beings, giving them outdoor time and everything that I had as a kid, that I can't imagine a little kid not having. I can't imagine what happens to them. They have rates of autoimmune diseases that are just, if you had gone back 50 years and said there's a population that has this rates of chronic disease at age 15, a country that, if you reported that to a country, they would have started a national emergency, that there was either a nuclear fallout or something. They couldn't believe it. And yet we are accepting that. We're accepting so much unhealth in our society. It's kind of madness. So we have to roll back.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for explaining your vision from the origin of the world to what could be our future.
And one more thought, it's that life got this far against all odds, and it's a powerful force, creative, healing, probing, innovative force, and we are life. And it's just that now we carry the entire biosphere. Mother Gaia has given us the keys and said, it's over to you because you're the majority of the biosphere now. So we are in charge of the steering wheel on the bus of evolution worldwide. And when we wake up to that, we go, well, it's responsibility. The future of evolution itself and all life forms is driven by humans and human minds and human hearts.
Thank you, Bruce. Before finishing this interview, I wanted to asking the harvest of the day to all the guests, and if they can recall a moment or an event when they were a child, it could be a meal, when they felt really radically or not connected with their environment, and if they can tell me the people, the atmosphere, the place, the food.
Well, for me, growing up in British Columbia and Canada, we would go out to the orchards in like May, June, and we would harvest these sour cherries. And they're kind of lighter color, but they're only good for about 3 weeks. And we would harvest those and bring them home. We'd eat a lot of them, too many, off the tree. And then my mother would make a cherry pie. She would make her own crust, everything from scratch. And for me, that was the most exquisite time because it was the harvest for a northern latitude, that we could have that was really special. And it just, every piece of that pie for me was the memory of a really good childhood.
Wow, wonderful. And activated your senses. You activate mine when you're telling the story.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Bruce. And I was, you explained everything with so much clarity and patience for someone who doesn't know so much about science.
I hope your kids will get something out of it too.
I'll make them listen to this. Thank you so much, Bruce. Is there anything you want to add?
That people should come to Harvest. They should plan to come here in the subsequent years. It's been, for Catherine and I, it's been a phenomenal, beautiful, glowing blue experience. And just the people here, I mean, just the people here give you incredible hope for the future.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for watching the Harvest series podcast, and see you soon for another episode.